For millions of years, humans thrived as nomadic, egalitarian hunter-gatherers. It was only around 10,000 years ago that a few societies around the world began to experiment with sedentism, agriculture, and the hoarding of resources. These societies spurred feedback loops of growth, inequality, and environmental devastation, conquering and colonizing and domesticating everyone and everything in their path, causing the sixth largest mass extinction in the history of life on Earth. Today, we live in a world that is a mismatch of our evolution in more ways than one. We feel disconnected, isolated, and powerless. Can we find our way back to a life that better matches how humans ought to live? What can we learn about how to live well from other cultures who've already got it figured out? Is there time to reverse our self destructive trajectory? How can we reclaim our wildness? These are the themes of the Rewilding podcast. I'm your host, Peter Michael Bauer. This podcast is produced and made possible from supporters on Patreon. Thank you. If the Rewilding podcast inspires you, gives you hope, or makes you think, please subscribe, share it on social media, and become a patron at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. If you're new to rewilding or you just want to expand your perception of it, I recommend attending one of my Rewilding 101 workshops, which I offer both in person in Portland, Oregon, and online for those who live around the world via Zoom. You can check upcoming dates and register at rewildportland.com. So, this is my 50th episode of the Rewilding podcast. And I've talked a lot about what rewilding means to me and to other people, but I've never talked about if there was a wrong way to rewild. And somebody posed that question to me, and I thought it would be a fun 50th episode to kind of explore that as a question. And I don't like talking in a vacuum by myself. And so I invited my friend here to join me today, who did not want to have their image captured nor their voice captured and wanted to remain anonymous. So I thought it would be fun to have them don an avatar and still join me over Zoom. So thank you for joining me on the Rewilding podcast.
Thanks for having me, Peter.
Can I talk about like how we know each other or
Yeah, that seems reasonable, like
okay.
a reasonable thing to do.
So my friend here met me through a program I did years ago called Foundations in Rewilding, and has stayed involved tangentially and somewhat interactively with different aspects of the Rewild Portland community. They are studying to be an anthropologist. Is this an accurate
That
statement?
that is accurate. Yeah, that is an
Okay,
accurate
great.
statement.
So I want to say this because it's been like one of the things I've wanted to do this year is focus on interviewing more anthropologists as part of the podcast, and more people that are sort of like entangled with academia who respect the ideas of like peer review, even though obviously there are problems with peer review. But in the time that we're living in, where like there's so much misinformation and
Mhm.
people are believing in made up conspiracy theories just based on a single social media post or something like that, to really be trying to create a lot of content that includes people who are along the same lines of, trusting, not necessarily trusting fully in like science, capital S, but people who trust in sort of the methods around what is real or what is true,
Mhm. Mhm.
and what is not. Just to,
Yeah,
and of course, all of those things are, there's like deep philosophical
sure.
conversations behind
Yeah.
all of that stuff too. But you know what
Mhm.
I'm saying.
Yeah, there's like some structural rigor in like how we determine things that we believe
Exactly.
and things that we don't believe. Yep.
Exactly. Thank you for using the academic vernacular for me. As a
I don't
non-academic, I
I
forget
wouldn't go.
about words like rigor, um, except when I'm picking up roadkill, and then it's,
Mm,
rigor mortis. Okay,
yeah,
sorry.
yeah, there it comes in.
Um, so I thought that you would be a good person to have this conversation with, in part because I just think you're really intelligent. I like having conversations with you about stuff. Also, you like to push back against some of the things I say sometimes, which I appreciate. Also, you have because you went through the foundations program and have been sort of around Rewild Portland for many years, you have a really good idea, I think, of what rewilding means to us as a community here. And so, with that kind of in mind, I'm going to kind of dive into this topic of
Mhm.
the wrong way to rewild. First of all, like, what is your take on this question? Like, what is the wrong way to rewild? Like, how would you
Yeah,
come at that?
sure. Well, so I did the assigned reading prior to actually I did most of the assigned reading. Um, and yeah, I mean, like what I kind of saw in a lot of that was kind of looking at the ways in which rewilding functions within a broader social economic context of like like now neoliberal capitalism and how like naturally, within that system, people will gravitate towards modes of producing knowledge, producing social capital, producing money, livelihood, that are kind of antithetical to rewilding, right? Like there's that tension always when you're doing
Totally.
something that is like structurally incompatible with the broader social and economic system that you're in. So that was like I got a lot of just the kind of like shenanigans that happen when people are like trying to become rewilding gurus and shit,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or like when people kind of lose track of the wholesale thing that's being called for in a practice like rewilding, and just like the depth of what that actually means. So that was, I mean, kind of me just like regurgitating
Yeah.
what
The
I
gist.
read. But I guess the
Yeah.
other thing that comes to mind is like, I don't know if we would really call this rewilding because this is like agrarian socialism, but like the Pol Pot shit, right? And the like the Cambodian, like the Khmer Rouge and the kind of like top down, trying to grapple with uh
I'm taking notes to come back to this.
yeah. Which is maybe not so relevant to the context that we're in like immediately in this moment, but I would maybe put that if I was making a list of the wrong ways to rewild, I would probably at least throw
Yes.
that in there.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, those are
Cool.
some initial thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah,
What do you think?
I think we'll probably touch on all of that and maybe
Mhm.
even go further in the socialist aspect of it or the Pol Pot form of socialism anyway, later on and fascism as well.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I think, when people ask me that question, it's hard to respond with a succinct answer because first of all, like, what does rewilding even mean to the person asking the question? Is there a wrong way to rewild? If you
Mhm.
were a conservation rewilder, you'd be like, yes, breaking up landscapes into islands would be the wrong thing because their prescription is to connect islands of forest to create like corridors, right?
Mhm.
So if you're coming from like a different perspective, what rewilding means altogether, then yeah, there's going to be a wrong way if there's a prescription to it.
Mhm.
If you're looking at it through the cultural rewilding lens, to me, there isn't a wrong way to rewild if the intention is still there. Because to me, the cultural rewilding is actually the intention to do the thing.
Mhm.
And so if you don't have those intentions, then you're just not rewilding. It's not like you're doing it wrong. You're just not doing it,
Mhm.
if that makes any sense. So,
Mhm.
I think the concepts of like right and wrong are very much like I- I wouldn't say that they're like fully like Judeo-Christian or something like that, but there's
Sure.
definitely like, some weird concepts around like doing things the right way or the wrong way. Um,
Yeah, it's dogma. We're getting
yeah,
into the territory of dogma at that point. Yeah.
totally. I mean, at the same time, there's every culture has like taboos, right? Like,
Mhm.
societies, humans working together are all social contracts. So, in the scope of like right and wrong, when it's just a group of friends who are like making their own social norms, there's definitely like a right and wrong in that context, but it's not like necessarily the same thing as like the biblical right and wrong or like good and evil. You know what I mean?
Sure, sure.
Um, so I don't know if those are like, in some way intrinsic qualities of human culture or if they're um, like just complete inventions that have nothing to do with who we are. But I feel like humans create these kinds of concepts of like right and wrong or like do's and don'ts.
Mhm. Mhm.
Might be a better way of putting it. Do's and don'ts. Like I don't know if you remember that Vice when Vice was actually a magazine. I don't know if it still is, but they had like ridiculous hipster do's and don'ts all the time. And I think that I've always wanted to do like a do's and don'ts for rewildings.
Nice.
Maybe I'll make some memes.
Cool. Yeah, I think that was before my time, but it sounds
Yeah,
funny.
Vice. Uh-oh, you just aged yourself.
Oh no.
Giving away too much
I
information.
know.
They're gonna find you. Yeah, so I think one of the ways of kind of looking at rather than is it like is there a wrong way to rewild or a right way to rewild, but rather is this the same thing? Like is
Mhm,
this rewilding or is this not rewilding? Or is this what I mean when I say rewilding or is this not what I mean when I say rewilding?
mhm,
I
mhm.
think it's sort of a better framework of that question.
Yeah,
And I always say like there's no one right way to rewild because if the intent is there, then whatever your actions are towards that intention, whether it's, good or bad or whatever, whether it leads to more rewilding or less, it's still there's an intention to reclaim wildness or, break down the barriers of captivity that are preventing wildness from emerging.
right.
Um, yeah, what is your thoughts around that?
Well, I mean, I feel like entire books can and have been written, right, about this idea
Sure.
of like defining things and, when like this, both the kind of like dichotomous idea of right and wrong and how that manifests differently in different places. And maybe we are predisposed to have a more rigid and like binary view of that because of our cultural baggage.
Hmm.
Um, but words. Yeah, I mean, I think what I hear you saying is just like advocating for a more fluid, less rigid sense of how we like instead of things being like rigidly defined lines, like there's these permeable concepts that are walking around, kind of interacting with each other. And, some things are maybe like far beyond what we might consider the bounds of an idea, but there's like it doesn't have a hard stop. There's gradation and fluidity. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah, I was just in my recent podcast talking to Monica Wild, who has this wild human biome project where they're like eating wild foods. And I kept trying to get her to like say what the restrictions were to wild foods. Like if you're doing a
Mm-hmm.
study and people are supposed to be eating wild foods, where's the line, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, and I agree with her assessment that it's ambiguous. There isn't like some
Hmm.
stark line. You can, and so that makes the study like that challenging in some ways, but also just like defining wildness versus too little control versus too much control is sort of like how
Hmm.
I like to frame that idea around wildness. And so yeah, having this sort of like what does rewilding mean? What does wildness mean? It's all sort of convoluted anyway in certain capacities, but
Yeah.
you kind of know when it's total bullshit, right? Like in that
Hmm.
study where they're supposed to be eating wild food and the participants are determining what that means, they're not gonna like go get fast food. You know what I mean? Like
That's a little too far.
that's not
Yeah.
wild food. Um,
Totally.
and so I think about that with rewilding specifically, in that kind of way too. It's like what are we really striving for here? And how are the ways in which it's sort of like turned back into the same old thing that it always was?
Hmm.
Um, and I think, yeah, kind of one of my favorite ways of approaching this is also just talking about like the evolution of subcultures in general and what happens to them, um, as a way of kind of understanding how the term rewilding has been watered down and how a
Yeah.
lot of people like learn about rewilding, but they don't even know that it's like that it emerged from anarcho-primitivism or like an anarchist milieu. They think
Hmm.
that it's just like some sort of paleo lifestyle trend or
Sure.
something along those lines.
Yeah.
Um, and
Yeah.
to kind
Or
of,
maybe go ahead, sorry.
no, no, you go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say really appreciated this article, and I remember you reading like there was a Facebook comment that you saw, or this was the article that you wrote. There was like the Facebook comment that you saw of the person who was like, "Why is this nested under the anarchism section of
Exactly.
Wikipedia or whatever?" And I think it's like because it could just be right that people are like, "Oh, I don't, like I just think this is a lifestyle thing, and I don't read that deeply into it, like you just said." But I think there's also just like people don't know what anarchism is And maybe
Totally.
people do have a really deep relationship to rewilding in a more like substantial way,
Mm,
whatever that looks like structurally or in an embodied sense, but like they just don't have the context to understand the connections of these ideas. But
totally.
anyway,
That's a really
go
good
ahead.
point.
Yeah.
No, that's a really good point. And I feel like that's also a probability because I barely ever, in a lot of the, even just when I'm talking about rewilding, it's not like I mention anarchy or anarchism or anything like on some fundamental level all the time. And so there's
Mm-hmm.
plenty of people who could come into it without knowing that. But I think the
Mm-hmm.
longer they're around, the longer they kind of see those things or understand them on a deeper level, at least, I would hope.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, so there's this great article that I recommend people read. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. It's called Geeks, Mops, and Sociopaths in Subcultural Evolution, which is such a funny title anyway. And I had my friend here read it before this just so we could kind of talk about it. But I'll kind of lay out the framework here really quick. So this person is not like, I mean, there's no citations or anything in this essay. It's just kind of like an off the cuff thing, but it makes sense if you'll understand as I explain what happens. So basically, there's like a cool new thing in his example, which I'll use. There's like a new type of music, right? So there's like a little town somewhere. They have like a new form of music. It starts making a little scene. There's like a few bands. The people who are writing the music are like the creators of this new cool thing. And the people who are just like in love with it are the fanatics or the geeks. And they go to all the shows. They want to, be the roadies or whatever. They're like helping the band set up. They're selling the merch. They make up part of this scene because they are super into the thing. Um, Now the scene gets like, if there's enough of those people, it creates a scene. Then you have mops, which are just as a term for members of the public. I think maybe poser might be too harsh, but just somebody who's like interested in the thing, this cool new thing, but not a fanatic. They're not like obsessed with it. They're just like, oh, this is cool. And they're going to be the ones that come in and buy the CD or the T-shirt or things like that. And they're participating sort of like, on the fringe or in it, but not super in it. And that creates the whole scene, right? Well, if enough time goes by and the cool new thing becomes popular enough, more and more of the members of the public or the mops end up being attracted to the scene, and it starts to get really big. At that point, I think he has some sort of like, hypothetical mathematical equation of like, if there are six mops to one fanatic in the scene, you know, um, then it becomes ripe for exploitation because there is a market for product. And so at that point, you have capitalists, or what they refer to as sociopaths, who don't care about the scene, but are just wanting to make money off this cool new thing. They move in, they analyze it. They're very cunning, so they can figure out how to um, either sell it themselves or rebrand it or become one of the creators themselves. But they do a new thing light. Like they do the light version because they realize if they take the cool new thing, but make it a little bit more like mainstream stuff, then they're going to be able to sell it to way more people. And so they slowly, essentially drain the original cool concept into a lighter, more sellable version of itself and in doing so, basically deplete the scene and cause it to eventually collapse, and then they move on to the next thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I think in rewilding, like, so I guess first of all, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I thought it was a it was a really good read. I think an incredibly useful framework. I got a lot out of it. I didn't have time to like dig into this person's like general body of
Sure.
work, so I didn't have a
Yeah.
full sense of like where they were coming from.
Hmm.
But I thought that the thing in of itself was really cool. And it actually I realized so I it gave me some like personal insight too because I was like, oh, I just expect everybody to be a sociopath. Like everybody who's like a creator or like a geek, I expect them to be sociopaths. So I'm like very subculture averse in a lot of ways, or I like don't necessarily
Mm-hmm.
join the cult. Always, sometimes I do join the cult, and when I have, it's usually been I've been like, oh, there's sociopaths here,
Yeah, right.
and I like anyway, it was just interesting, and I was noticing too, like when I was thinking about doing this podcast with you, I was like, oh, I feel like a little bit like nervous or uneasy about like engaging with Peter's like public persona, you know, like the thing, like the parasocial thing.
Totally.
But and it's actually feeling fine. But I was like reading this, I was like, oh, it's because like I think that people who do that are all fucking sociopaths because
You think I'm a
so anyway,
sociopath? That's fine.
it was a really interesting but I got it was a rich read. I got a lot out of it.
Yeah, awesome.
Oh, also, am I allowed to like curse? Like, are there things that I'm not allowed to say in terms
No.
of like, okay, cool.
This is
In terms of the
explicit
common sense, yeah.
parental advisory podcast.
Cool.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, it definitely it's an interesting take on subcultures in general and creatives and people who end up getting exploited by people who are more into, selling things or selling people out or whatever it is. Um, and I mean, I think everybody who's listening to this has probably been through a scene where that's been an experience, right? Like
Mhm.
that's just a classic thing. Um, so I kind of want to talk about how this happened to Rewilding. So
Mhm.
um, and how you sort of having your apprehensions about my public persona is actually things that have been happening for a really long time with my
Mhm.
public persona as well. So and how how it relates to that. Um, so the word rewilding came around in the 80s from the Earth First milieu. There were two sort of branches of it. The conservation rewilding, which grew a lot more out of Earth First once Dave Foreman left Earth First and started doing more conservation work and wrote Rewilding the West. And then the cultural rewilding side, which stayed sort of more as the left over the 80s and 90s became more anarchist oriented. Um, Anarcho-primitivism was one of the concepts that emerged from that as well, and rewilding became kind of a way of enacting that in the real world, like returning to the life ways, the theoretical life ways that humans had prior to the state and prior to agriculture. From there, it became, it was definitely like a scene, right? You had like some zines that were being made by different punks across the country. You had Green Anarchy magazine publishing an entire issue on rewilding. You had websites popping up here and there, and that's when I came to it in about 2004. And I was like, wow, this is a word that actually describes what I've been doing for the last, decade or whatever at that point.
Mhm.
Um, Maybe not a decade yet at that point, but basically the trajectory I'd been on for a really long time, and I had different words to kind of describe things, but nothing really clicked until I got to green anarchism, anarcho-primitivism, and rewilding. Um, I had come from it through Daniel Quinn, who was definitely not an anarchist, but just a brilliant mind. And so my way of kind of perceiving things was very different from like the anarchist scene itself. So when I started to promote rewilding as a concept, exactly kind of what you're saying, like people don't know that anarchy is a part of it, they might be doing anarchy whether or not they realize. I'm paraphrasing what you said, correct me if I'm wrong. People might be doing anarchy or whatever, whether they actually acknowledge or
Mhm.
understand that that's what they're doing.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, and so I was promoting rewilding, but I wasn't really using the word anarchy because I was specifically trying to create a sort of different concept around rewilding that, like, when I first started, was kind of breaking it free from those preconceived notions of like what anarchy was. And so part of me, it's ironic or not ironic, maybe it's just stupid for me to complain about this 20 years later when I did that myself, right? Um, Kind of talk about rewilding without saying the word anarchy, even if it's still the same concepts, just to kind of get it into mainstream ideas or whatever. I don't know exactly. I don't exactly remember my intentions other than
Mhm.
um, my goal when I was like 19 was to infiltrate the hipster artist scene of Portland and spread what I called animism at the time, like throughout that scene because I was super into like Joseph Campbell's The Power of Myth and thought that, the
Mhm.
artists were myth makers and storytellers and creatives and we could change the story of our world and then change the world. However, I'm much more pessimistic and cynical these days.
It's the natural way of things, I
I
think,
mean, I still
often.
believe it's possible. I just
Mm.
don't believe it's probable. I still think I still think
Sure.
it's a good thing for people to put their time and energy into.
Yeah.
Um, but one of the things that the guy who wrote this Geeks, Mops, and Sociopaths and Subcultural Evolution, at the very end of it, rather than being like, there's nothing we can do, sociopaths will invade our subcultures and destroy them.
Mhm.
Basically, what he says is the best defense against this is to be slightly evil.
Yeah.
Which, I disagree with his framing again around like the term evil. But what I would say is just
Sure.
like what he's essentially saying is to fill the niche of the sociopath capitalist before they get there,
Hmm.
right? To
Hmm.
like fill that vacuum because there's a vacuum being created when a scene expands, right? And all these
Right.
people are joining in and they're interested. And if you don't fill that vacuum with the original creators, then it's
Hmm.
going to get filled with people who are just going to, sell it to the highest bidder kind of situation, right?
Right.
And I feel like I did this sort of like accidentally with rewilding in that I was just like because my no, I guess not fully accidentally, but because my intention was to spread the concepts of rewilding through the sort of like artist hipster scene, all of my aesthetics were of this scene at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so my public persona was like, I'm, wearing American Apparel short shorts and, Ray-Ban Wayfarer sunglasses and
Hmm.
hide tanning in my backyard or whatever. In an urban backyard. Like the sort of images that I was promoting, or the image I was promoting of myself was this very much like mainstream type persona. So when you were saying like, you just sort of think everybody is a sociopath, that's essentially what a lot of people thought of me.
Mm.
I got like angry emails from lots of different people telling me I was a poser, that I needed to stop what I was doing and go away, that, I won't be around the rewilding scene in 10 years, which this is like 20
Mhm.
years ago now, which is funny, right?
A little
You won't
smug there,
even be
yeah.
around. And which I mean, and if I was one of those people, they would have been right because
Sure,
I've
sure.
seen this myself.
Yeah.
I became one of those defenders of the scene as well
Hmm.
later on when in around 2014, a lot of people did start to co-opt the term rewilding and water down
Yeah.
the cultural framework from it. Um, yeah, I don't know. Where are your thoughts?
Yeah. Let me generate content. Hang on. Yeah, I think the only thought that kind of popped into my mind is I feel like a lot of like the trouble with this, um, and I think that um, sorry, I had two thoughts at once,
It's
and I'm
okay.
not sure what to say first. I'll say the first one I had. I think that the trouble with with the whole thing, and I think the author got into this a little bit, but like the geeks, like are too, I think often are just like too nerdy to figure out how to fill that niche, right? How to
Totally.
be slightly evil in the way that is required to have things like promote and carry themselves through like the social and economic context that we're in. Um, so I think that's like that can be like just a big limitation is that people just don't are just like too like
Totally.
not yeah. Um, and I think that you're in a unique position where like you are a nerd, but like you do have like social, you have some of that social skill set to be able to navigate for, whatever reason that happened. That's how you turned out and are in the world. So, I think that you are, you do have some capacity to fill that niche, like you were saying. Um, yeah, I guess I didn't really get time to like explore this thought on my own. So this is like kind of off the cuff, but the other thought that I was just kind of like casually having as I was reading was feeling curious about like how I forget what was the term that the author used for like the like subcultures are dead and the new thing is something. Do you
I
remember in
can't
the article?
remember.
Okay, they like floated a new term, basically like a new kind of structure for what social subcultures might be evolving into, or what might actually be functional with and like have more longevity in the system that we're in. I forget the term that they use. But I was just kind of wondering how like I feel like the internet has made things really like fluid in a way, like where maybe before like things were a little bit more niche and insular, and it's hard to have that with a world wide web, or harder to maintain that. And maybe there's
Totally.
like more vulnerabilities there too. So I guess I was just, again, this is like off the cuff and not a fully explored idea, but yeah, I was just curious about how that and how that worked its way into this idea
Totally.
and into what's happening right now, right? Like in this moment with rewilding.
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation. I mean, I think the internet has like sped up the rate at which a subculture transforms over time and space.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think about any subculture, any idea, like think about just Christianity. Like think about
Yeah.
Christianity as like a belief system or feminism,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Like how many different permutations of these things are there now? How many,
Right.
if you're like, I'm a feminist, are you a first wave, second wave, third, are you a
Sure.
rad
Yeah.
femme? Are you, you know what I mean? Like, and how do you
Yeah.
say that, well, that's the wrong way of doing feminism or the right way or
Hmm.
whatever, right? Like
Hmm.
all of these are now, and this is just part of the problem with like language in general, is when the meaning of something changes to a specific group of people, but they keep using the same word,
Hmm.
then it makes it
Hmm.
really hard to communicate anymore. The whole point of language is to like, well, I don't know if that's the point of language, but to I would think that, having language as a tool for communication is the main point of it, and being able
Hmm.
to communicate as best as possible by having the same meanings of things. But words change over time and space.
Right.
And I think that, yeah, the internet has increased the time and space because it can pull something from some tiny little place and project it everywhere, as opposed to like, Christianity colonizing slowly over thousands of years, you know what I
Right.
mean? And
Yeah.
then coming up with its own different weird permutations in all of those colonial projects, like
Hmm.
Mormonism in Utah or something, like
Yeah.
these weird little niche uh, versions of these things.
Right.
And so I think about that with rewilding too. Like there's kind of like there's no way to stop this from happening. And also it's funny because I'll talk to like, some of these friends. I have two friends that are like in academia. They're writing about rewilding a lot, and
Hmm.
they're interviewing me a lot as like somebody who's been around for a while doing it.
Hmm.
And I'll say things to them and they're like, I'm like, rewilding doesn't mean like going back to living as hunter-gatherers. That's dumb. And they're like,
Hmm.
okay, well you wrote that like 20 years ago. Like you
Yeah,
literally wrote
totally.
that. Like that was your
Right.
definition. And I'm like, fuck, where did I say that? So I mean like
Yeah.
even me, like and what's funny is like I'll change what it means to me in my head. And then I just sort of like assume that everyone else has this understanding already, you
Sure.
know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that comes down that's a problem, necessarily a problem. That's just like a thing to consider that for me, as one of the sort of like creator peoples within the context of
Hmm.
rewilding, to just keep in mind, like, this is, and even when I wrote my book Rewild or Die, which I think is a funny, now I call it a funny, like historical document, um,
Hmm.
mostly because I disagree with so much of what I wrote in it.
Sure.
And it's hard because people might read that and then assume that that's what rewilding means today, when I think it's changed dramatically over the last 20 plus years.
Hmm.
Um, but I think the intent is still the same in its core, which is to return to a reciprocal relationship with the land and each other as humans.
Yeah.
That to me is sort of, the defining characteristic and intent behind rewilding. It's anti-hierarchical or uh, yeah, I would just say anti-hierarchical in general. Although even the word hierarchy has multiple meanings, and
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
anti-exploitative, right? It's about living
Yeah.
in relative balance
Hmm.
with an ecosystem and one another. Egalitarian, where we don't destroy our land base or cause an extinction.
What an idea.
Yeah, who knew that that was possible? Um, Yeah, so I think if that's the intent of a person, one of the sort of like tangents I want to go down in here, I guess it's not a tangent, but in my Rewilding 101 class, I kind of have this matrix of different ways people can engage in rewilding as a way of like sort of looking and seeing how lots of different people are engaging in rewilding in various ways so that it's a mosaic
Hmm.
rather than
Mhm.
like rewilding means running away to the wilderness and wearing buckskins and shooting deer with bows and arrows or whatever. Like that's the furthest thing that from my mind when I think of rewilding anymore. And so I want people to kind of understand the full breadth of what rewilding means in terms of just um, exactly returning to a reciprocal life way. And you can
Yeah,
do that in a city, you can do that anywhere as long as you're working on that trajectory, right?
right.
The challenge is like there are three levels of impact, or not impact. Yeah, I guess you could say that. Or you have like a quick fix, you
Mhm.
have a retrofit, and you have a systemic change. And this is something that I got from Hazel during their social forestry permaculture class.
Mhm.
So the quick fix is like, and this is the example I use in my 101 class because it's just goofy. Um, if rewilding is about learning from our environments of evolutionary adaptation to understand how we are adapted to live in this world and then change the world back to how we are adapted to live in reciprocity, to live in egalitarian life ways with each other. We're looking at this across a full spectrum. So not just socially and subsistence wise, but also like even in our own bodies. If we evolved, and so here it is. The human body evolved to defecate in a squatting position.
Yeah, yeah, it
We
did.
we are adapted to poop in the squatting position. If
Uh-huh.
we are not in the squatting position, say if we're on a toilet seat, um, the pelvis is actually, I'm sure you know this, is compressing the
I know all
colon.
about this.
Don't we all? The colon is being compressed by the pelvis in that sitting position, which means you have to push your shit out, which leads to statistics like countries where there are seat toilets has the highest majority of hemorrhoids because
Mm.
hemorrhoids are part of pushing your shit out over and over
Mhm.
again every day, your whole
Right,
fucking life.
right.
That's an example of how our current environment is at a mismatch with our biology.
Mhm.
And so if rewilding, if we're talking about going back to, not going back to a certain era, but going back to this relationship with place,
Mhm.
it'll look different than it did before. But what we're returning to in rewilding is this relationship. Um, so what do you do in this scenario if you were going to like rewild this, right? Like what is the quick fix? Well, the quick fix is to just stand on your toilet seat and squat on the toilet,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
The retrofit is to
I did that for a
buy,
while.
yeah, yeah. The retrofit is to buy or make a seat that wraps around the toilet that you can stand and squat on, right?
Mhm.
A bench or a stool to
Right.
stand and squat on. And then a systemic would be like getting rid of the toilet or like
Mhm.
swapping it out with one of those like trough
Mhm.
toilets that they have in other countries or something, right?
Sure.
So the challenge with this idea of like, is someone rewilding or not? Is the intention to um, get to the systemic level or not? Is it to just make our
Mhm.
lives more
Mhm.
comfortable? And
Mhm.
one of the like quotes that I was constantly posting by one of these sociopathic entrepreneurs who was co-opting rewilding was something along the lines that he was quoted saying, and I think it was like a Huffington Post article, like rewilding to me isn't about going back to anything. It's about appropriating things from the hunter-gatherer way of life so that our lives are less like a human factory farm and more like a really nice human zoo.
Wow. What a what an
I'm like, dude, thank you. Thank you for saying it like out loud, the quiet part out loud or whatever,
yeah,
like
yeah,
in
yeah.
a
Uh-huh.
succinct way. Because that
Right.
exemplifies this thing that we're talking about in that quote.
Totally.
Right? It's
Yeah.
not about escaping captivity or dismantling the prison. It's
Mhm.
about making prison life more comfortable while the world burns
Totally.
around us.
Totally. And we all have like zoo psychosis. Have you heard
Yeah,
about, you know about this?
yeah, caging,
Yeah,
zoo.
gnarly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
talk about it. What
Oh,
is it?
well, I mean, I don't know that much about it, but just like I mean, I'm sure most of the people listening to this podcast also know about this, but just like the, yeah, like if there's just like a huge level of psychological effects that animals who are held in captivity experience, and it can look like a wide range of behaviors. And it's kind of like generally colloquially called zoo psychosis.
Mhm.
Um, and it can look like just like repeatedly doing a behavior like obsessively over and over again, or just kind of being like lethargic and depressed, or Yeah, I mean, and obviously we don't have the words to communicate, right? To have the full rich, which is the, the whole animal psychology thing. But yeah, anyway, zoo psychosis.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think it's important to bring that up because obviously those are all things that we have as humans too
Right,
in
right,
this
exactly.
society,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And oftentimes when I'm like critiquing the quick fix, the problem
Hmm.
with critiquing a quick fix or a retrofit as not being cool enough or not systemic enough
Hmm.
of a transformation is that sometimes you need those quick fixes to just fucking get up in the morning, right? Like,
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
and so it can be kind of like an ableist thing to just critique quick fix in
Hmm.
that way. And I think about this too, like quick fix to me, a better way of thinking about it is like first aid,
Mm-hmm. Harm reduction.
harm
Yeah.
reduction. I
Hmm.
mean, if I'm having a heart attack, what's the first thing I should do?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, do you know? Yeah, I know you know. I'm having a heart attack. What should you give me?
Right. Oh, I mean, has your pulse stopped or are you just having a heart attack?
I'm having a heart attack. I'm not dead yet. What should I do?
I
What's the
should,
fastest, easiest thing I could do right now?
I mean, right now you could call 911
Well, that's
and
true.
tell someone that you're having a heart attack.
But is there a pill
Yeah,
I can
that would
take?
probably be the first thing. You could take some aspirin too, but
All right,
if
that's
you're not, yeah.
yeah. So I mean, there's a thing I could do, take aspirin, then I'm gonna
Mhm.
go. So that's the quick fix, right? That might save my life, and I needed that.
Right.
Um, then maybe I go to the hospital. Maybe I need a surgery. That's a retrofit, you know.
Hmm.
The systemic is going to be preventative medicine. I need to change my habits to prevent another heart attack from happening. Might involve moving more, might involve, lowering cholesterol or whatever. I don't know all the what's the hippest way to do any of that stuff in the moment. Um, but the idea of the quick fix is important because it does save our lives. It makes our lives easier.
Right.
Um, but we can't stop there
Yeah.
is the thing, right? And so I think what the sociopaths like to do when it comes
Hmm.
to a political thing like
Hmm.
rewilding was cleanse it of the politics
Right.
and make it just about being more comfortable with your life, which
Right.
is exactly what that essay says about making something the cool new thing
Hmm.
watered down and more accessible to a wider audience. Because now
Hmm.
people aren't having to think about what it means to break free from civilization. They don't have to think about breaking free from captivity or undoing domestication. They can
Hmm.
just replicate aspects of our environment of evolutionary adaptation to make them a
Yeah.
little happier.
Yeah.
But it's not going to break us out of the prison. It's not actually rewilding because it has nothing to do with wildness. It's
Sure.
essentially faux wilding or like zoo wilding. Making a
Yeah.
zoo cage
Yeah.
more natural. So it's a
Right.
little bit better on this animal, but we're still not breaking them out of captivity. And
Right.
this
Yeah.
this wouldn't be a problem really if
Mhm.
our society wasn't driving us off of a cliff
Sure.
environmentally,
Sure.
you know?
Yeah. We'd have time to keep, fucking around,
Yeah.
figuring it out. Yeah. I think there's also, this kind of goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning, but like this whole idea of like what is, like this um like tiered approach to rewilding, and just like all of the different, you're talking about Christianity earlier and all of the different permutations that things can take. I mean, that's just kind of like life is a diversity machine, right? Like
Totally.
things
Yes.
just like we can see that in like our biological world and in all kinds of ways, but like things will just kind of take off and become other things and one thing will split into like a million different things, right? And I think that's inevitable. Like every single thing people have ever tried to do, whether it be Christianity or rewilding or whatever else, like this is a problem always, right? Where
Yeah.
people are kind of trying to figure out like, okay, this has become like a million different things. And so how do we like parse that as people? Um, yeah, and I think there's like uh we were talking about things being fluid earlier because I think like everything interacts with everything else, right? So like you like there are like you were using rewilding, like there are elements of rewilding, in that kind of maybe first tier, what did you call it, the quick fix tier,
Hmm.
that have made their way in, and like those are still like they're not like they're not disconnected from where they came from, right? But they're kind of like they've spread themselves into a different thing and they're like further from the source.
Totally.
Um, but yeah, I guess that's just like inevitable, like it's just like an inevitable part of these like big life structures interacting with each other and like giving and taking parts of themselves. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and it's sort of, I kind of anticipated this even back when I wrote my book. I think in the introduction, I was like, I probably won't believe a lot of these things in 10 years, but we'll
Mm,
see.
mm,
I think one of the challenges with, and I think about this too, because sometimes I read about like Shinto Buddhism or like the Tao and stuff like that. And I'm just like older scripts and I'm like, oh, this just sounds like rewilding, how I think of like rewilding or
yeah,
whatever.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
or
totally.
even just like, even like elements of like Christian mysticism. And there's
Yeah,
just certain things where I'm just
absolutely.
like,
Mhm.
I feel like people keep trying to come back to this in
Yeah.
every like era through different mechanisms, and
Hmm.
every time it just like hits this wall of capitalism, or it
Right.
hits this wall of like transformation and exploitation. So it's literally like
Yeah.
people are just constantly reinventing the wheel of
Hmm.
trying to dismantle civilization and return to reciprocity.
Hmm.
Um, and this is just the most current permutation of it. I mean, one of the
Right.
things I like to say too is that rewilding has existed as long as captivity has existed because things
Hmm.
don't want to be held captive. Everything
Yeah.
is in some way trying to break free from captivity. Even unless they've been like completely domesticated to the point
Sure.
where they won't open, they won't run out of a cage if the door is open,
Yeah. Yeah.
that kind of thing.
Hmm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah.
So, and I feel like that's actually an apt metaphor too for a lot of people within civilization is like the door is open and most people aren't going to run away, especially if they're in a well-off country,
Sure.
um, which wasn't even the case, during a lot of the colonial period, because you see like all of those people who ran away to live with native people on the fringes of the frontier who just disappeared or never
Hmm.
came back, or like, there's constant
Right.
journals about like, oh, yeah, that person left and they won't come back. You know,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
like
Yeah.
a normal thing that people want to get away from this
Hmm.
system. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. And very few examples of like the reverse happening consensually, right?
totally.
People,
Yeah,
yeah. Hmm.
exactly. Yeah, well, I mean, it's always the guise of protection, which is how domestication, um, sells itself. This is for
Hmm.
the safety of something or other. I have a meme that I made. It's it's a play off of that the Anakin Skywalker talking to Padme in the field meme. Anyway,
Hmm.
where there's
Hmm.
I have like a Jesus looking shepherd talking to a sheep, and the the Jesus looking shepherd is saying, "I will protect you from all the other predators out here." And the sheep is going, "Oh, cool. And you won't predate on us either, then, right?" And then it's just Jesus smiling. And then the sheep going, "You won't predate on us either, right?" And this is just sort of the whole thing of
Yeah.
domestication. It's always under the guise of protection. I mean, and that goes
Right. Right.
beyond animals to people too, like fascism.
Absolutely. Hmm.
How many, when the Patriot Act was passed, for example,
Hmm.
after September 11th, how many freedoms did the American citizens lose in
Right.
that bill because they were afraid? And the guise was
Hmm.
protection. It's always
Hmm.
protection. We're protecting
Yeah.
you.
That's
Uh,
how they taught us in my seventh grade civics class, that government is just always a negotiation between freedom and protection. There's like they're like these two dichotomous
mm,
like opposites that
yeah,
you like that's how it's like framed from the very beginning. It's like you can
yeah.
either have freedom or you can have protection, and it's always a balancing act between the two.
I mean, I
Yeah.
think that's essentially the state.
Yeah,
I mean,
totally.
that
Right.
is the same. That is how the state operates. Like if you think about the origins, James C. Scott's uh, Against the Grain, Deep History of the
Mhm.
Earliest States, he talks about like and also Europe and the People Without History. They
Mhm.
talk about this sort of revolving um, warlords in the last 10,000 years between agriculturalists and pastoralists. You have two different forms of domestication. Um, and eventually, the pastoralists were always just had a military advantage because their food storage was mobile. Agriculturalist
Right.
food storage is not mobile. So they were susceptible to attacks from pastoralists. And eventually
Mhm.
the pastoralists were like, Hey, listen. Listen. How about instead of stealing 10% of your shit today, you just give us 10% and we'll protect you from all the
There you
other
go.
warlords out here.
Yeah. Hmm.
And that's the formation of state. That's taxes, right? That's like how it
Totally.
all kind of gets going. Um, and so when I think about rewilding and wildness and our intention, um, yeah, that idea that our intention is to break out of this relationship, not to
Hmm.
protect ourselves. And that can be scary for a lot of people, which makes sense as
Absolutely.
to why people would not want to try to do systemic aspects of rewilding and what makes it so
Hmm.
much easier to sell rewilding related products when you
Yeah.
exclude the political side of things
Yeah.
and an environmental side of things.
Yeah. This is like a random tangent,
Mhm.
but it's really because you were saying you said a statement earlier that just pinged because I think that these kinds of statements are interesting, and the part of me that's a contrarian always wants to be like, okay, well, what about this?
Yeah.
you, you said something about like beings always want like orient towards freedom, like are always seeking
Mm.
freedom, beings in captivity. Well, unless they've been just like so fucked that they can't anymore. And I tend to, that seems true to me. Like that seems like it reflects what I see in the world. But the, I was like, what do you think? Sorry. What's your take on lichens? You know what I'm
Lichens.
talking about? Where like the fungi like farms the alga. Yeah. Does that like
Yeah.
factor
So
in at
there's,
all?
yeah, I mean, a good tangent that we could, yeah. So,
We don't have to go down this tangent.
no,
I
no,
was
this is
just
great. This is
curious.
great because it makes me
Yeah.
think of, so there's two different evolution. There's coevolution,
Hmm.
right? Coevolution just means the way different life forms interact with each other and have
Hmm.
and change each other based on their interactions. So they
Right.
co-evolve together. Um,
Hmm.
there are multiple types of coevolution. The two that I kind of zero in on as sort of the two extremes are
Hmm.
mutualism and parasitism.
Hmm.
So what is the relationship between mutualism and parasitism? You know, mutualism is where both things are benefiting. Parasitism
Hmm.
is where one thing is benefiting more than the other, or harming the other thing while it is, maybe it's consuming it, right?
Sure.
Um, and those things are going to co-evolve. Well, a lot of the time, what happens with parasitism is that the coevolution lasts, if it lasts long enough,
Hmm.
they end up needing each other.
Right. Yeah.
And then it becomes mutualism.
Hmm.
But it could have started out as parasitism. So, like an example
Sure.
might be, okay, willows. This isn't the best example, but it kind of leads into maybe what I'm talking about. So, willows, the tree, co-evolved with beavers. Beavers eat willows. That's like their staple, right?
Hmm.
And so, the regenerative adaptive response through natural selection for willows was to produce a lot of growth hormone so that
Hmm.
the level of consumption that was happening to them based on the
Hmm.
beaver um, didn't matter. They could just keep growing. So
Hmm.
much that, you could cut a stick of willow off a tree and plant it in the ground, and it's got so much growth hormone in it, it'll grow a clone of
Right.
itself.
Right.
That happened because they were being consumed by this other creature, right? So they have an adaptive response. And there's like seeds are like this too, right? There's lots of seeds that have to go through a digestive tract, even in order to just germinate, because they have co-evolved being consumed by these things. They had to be able to withstand going through a digestive tract. That actually made it so that they had to go through the digestive tract. Now it's kind of a form of mutualism where a species eats a seed and then takes it far away and defecates somewhere else. So there's like this whole thing of like life is constantly sort of adapting and in competition at some points, in cooperation at some points, and it's kind of like a balance between all of that, right?
Hmm.
So when I think of this idea of like lichen,
Hmm.
where you have three different species, it's bacteria, fungi, and algae. The algae is photosynthesizing, the fungi is like creating a structure and eating the algae, basically getting the nutrients out of the algae. And there's a
Hmm.
bacteria in the mix. I don't remember how that plays a role.
Sure.
Maybe it's making certain things bioavailable or something like that. I
Hmm.
don't know.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, you have this relationship that to me is more of a mutualistic one than a parasitic one. Even though the fungus
Hmm.
is consuming the thing, they're creating a structure for the algae to be that where it is, right?
Right.
and it's not like killing it off.
Sure,
It's
sure.
part of like an ecosystem of
Hmm.
beings or something like that.
Hmm.
And I think about that with domestication too. So,
Yeah.
I think domestication is essentially parasitism on an
Hmm.
extreme scale, like captivity in general.
Right.
Because what's happening is we are um, separating out a species from all of the other interactions that it's happening within an ecosystem.
Hmm.
We're basically like zeroing in, it's alienation, to put it
Hmm.
in Anna Tsing's word. Domestication is a form of alienation because
Totally.
we alienate things from the rest of the world to control them.
Hmm.
And in doing so, it weakens their ability to exist and adapt without human assistance.
Right.
So it's not a coevolution that is mutualism that's making it stronger. It's making it weaker. I hate the word stronger, weaker, less likely
Sure.
to adapt or less
Yeah.
adaptable in the long run. You know,
Hmm.
um, does that make sense? Is that a good
It does.
answer, or what do you think? You're
I thought
like,
that
Nah, I don't think so, Peter."
was no, I was on board with you. Yeah, that makes sense. I was thinking about dogs. I think we don't have to go down this tangent, but I think dogs are really interesting.
Yeah,
Anyway,
I think, I
yeah.
mean, dogs are a great example because I think,
Hmm.
and I made a meme about this too, where I was like, I think it started out as mutualism. I think wolves and humans
Hmm.
had the cool
Hmm.
mutualistic relationship. But as soon as you put the leash on the dog, as soon as you start selectively breeding a dog,
Right.
that
Yeah.
is captivity. That
Yeah.
is
To the
no
point where they
longer,
get psychosis. Like you breathe.
that's exactly
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
Like you just like
Yeah.
destroyed their bodies and minds.
If
Yeah.
you don't allow the creature or the thing to exit the relationship, that's
Hmm.
captivity. And
Right.
so when wolves and humans were working together, they were autonomous,
Hmm.
even if they were working together. But at some point, humans were like, I'm going to put a leash on this dog and prevent it
Hmm.
from walking away from this.
Right. Yeah.
That's domestication. That is
Yeah.
parasitism because
Hmm.
freedom of movement is like the quintessential aspect of being a willed animal, a willed
Yeah.
plant, is your ability to move on your own. Not
Right.
necessarily, you're still going to be within the constraints of your environment
Of
and the other
course. Yeah.
species that are there, obviously. Um, but to be held captive is more or
Yeah.
less what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is all great.
Maybe it's starting to get away from the central topic,
No,
but
no, I mean,
yeah.
this is getting into the heart of what rewilding means to us in this
Hmm.
context
Hmm.
now
Yeah.
versus this wider, lifestyle guru type of a situation.
Right. Yeah.
Um, I think I want to kind of circle back to one of the things you mentioned in the beginning.
Hmm.
You mentioned socialism and Pol Pot, and that's actually pretty niche. And I know that a lot of
Hmm.
people who listen to this might know what that is or who that is and what happened
Hmm.
over there. It would be cool for you to just kind of talk a little bit about that because I
Hmm.
think that relates to um, the notion of even if people were rewilding and doing it on a systemic level or
Hmm.
trying to, that can go in the wrong way too, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Because it can go against the intentions of egalitarian,
Right.
right? Of that
Yeah.
intention in and of itself. So I don't know if you want to
Yeah.
speak to that for a minute.
I mean, I like I have like a surface level knowledge about this, so I
Same,
can talk a little
but
bit about
same,
it.
but
If
yeah.
you or anybody listening is like, no, that's bullshit, like, call it. But my surface level like narrative understanding is essentially so like I think Pol Pot himself is like a really interesting figure. Because I think he did this thing where he was like he seems like he was really smart. And I've noticed that like sometimes really smart people, I've seen this in myself and I've also seen this in you, Peter, smart with like, we can parse that and unpack that, but like there's a thing there. And people who are like running with that thing, they will sometimes like have an idea and just be like, this is absolutely correct because nobody
Totally.
else can like argue with them on their level or like,
Totally.
like, so they
Yes.
might be just completely out of left field and like, running on their own bullshit, but like they can just like generate these stories because of just like like processing power of their own mind. Anyway, I feel like
Yeah.
that's part of what happened with Pol Pot. That's my theory. But to tell you the story.
But just yeah, Pol Pot was a socialist fundament, well, a socialist authoritarian in Cambodia.
Right, right. Yeah, he's in
Just to
Cambodia. Yeah, that is the context. I jumped the gun. He basically was part of, yeah, he was part of the Communist Party. I think I don't know if they called it the Communist Party, but he was like Marxist Leninist doing that kind of stuff. And he came to power through a, convoluted series of political machinations as things happen. That's my shorthand for not knowing what those
yeah.
machinations are.
Yeah, he was super fucking cunning
Yeah,
from
yeah.
my understanding. Yeah.
Yeah, and he ends up in power, and he basically, decides that Cambodia, is going to go through this like egalitarian revolution, and that in order to make it happen, they have to just like wipe out everything that happened before. So to like basically they need a clean slate, and so there's like this year zero thing where they're like, okay, we're restarting, we're like rebooting, and they just like kind of cap like like kind of capture the whole state. Maybe I mean you could say that the state already captures the populace, but like they go extra hard on it and they like really restrict people's freedom of movement, like can basically take away everybody's freedoms in the name of egalitarianism, force people out of cities. I know, yeah. Which is like only the cut. Like to me, I'm like, oh my gosh, oh, this could only happen in like the echo chamber of like some really smart guy's mind, Like, so, anyway, yeah, so they like kick everybody out of the cities and take them to the rural areas, and they like create these labor camps, and everybody's kind of forced to wear the same thing, and all religion is banned, and because everybody's supposed to be the same. And it's kind of part of this idea of like this utopic, like ultimately they're hoping to get rid of the state. At least that's what they say. They're hoping to get rid of the state and have it become, a communist utopia of like socialist agrarians, or communist agrarians, people who are living off of the land in harmony with the land, etc. But what ultimately happened, I mean, it's considered a genocide because millions of people died. Um, yeah, that's my
Yeah.
rendition.
That's a good summation, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting too, because if you I feel like there's this thing where when you talk about like wanting to live a socialist, communist, or anarchist type of life, people will often project these attempts at this that have happened in the past, where basically people in hierarchical states make these claims as if they're going to do that, and then turn around and just become full on raging authoritarians.
Right.
Um, and it's just happened over and over again. And I think it's just like a symptomatic thing of the state. But I will say this, as far as I know, this has never happened with anarchists. So,
There you go.
there's never been an anarchist state. All of those people have leveraged anarchists to help them overthrow governments,
Sure. Sure.
and then killed the anarchists. But like,
Yeah.
there's never been an anarchist state, right?
Yeah. Gotta
Um,
love a good purge.
So, I mean, but this does become a problem if you're thinking about changing things on a systemic way. And like this whole thing of Pol Pot, like forcing everybody to go out of the cities to go live rurally, like to me, that's like exemplifies some sort of rewilding gone wrong, you know? Like,
Yeah.
we're gonna force everybody to live as hunter-gatherers or some shit. You know what I
Right.
mean? Like it's totally crazy.
Yeah.
Um,
Mhm. I mean, I can get it on the level of like people are so sick they don't even know, like the door is open and they won't even walk out of it. And I don't know what it was like in like the mid 20th century Cambodia. I don't know anything about like what people's lives and realities and internal worlds and thoughts were like, but like I could like I'm not defending it. I'm just
sure,
saying like
sure. Yeah,
on the level of like, okay, people are so unwell and so like captivated by this like mythos of, the way that they're living, that we have to make them do it so that they'll see the light.
totally. I
Yeah.
mean, it's the same things happening in the United States right now, and not the same thing. But globally, there are these fascist movements or authoritarian movements, or like not authoritarian even on the outside, but what am I, populist, right?
Hmm.
And I would say like the majority of populists are probably sociopaths. No, just to,
Sure.
piggyback on what I just assume
Mhm.
that. No, I think that most populists end up becoming horrible authoritarians, regardless of what their rhetoric was.
Yeah.
And I think that we're going to see some really fucked up shit here. I mean, just even
Yeah.
it didn't matter who was going to win, we would have seen fucked up shit. But we're going to see some
Hmm.
really fucked up shit with, Christian nationalists gaining um,
Right.
the upper hand in this country, which is a fucking
Yeah.
nightmare.
Yeah.
Yeah, so who knows what is in store in that regard.
Yeah.
But I do think that that is like a cautionary tale. So,
Totally.
there's getting stuck in the quick fix, and then there's going full bore systemic, forcing people into a thing that's not the thing either, right? So
Right.
there's this I oftentimes I come back to Daniel Quinn, which as much as I critique him and a lot of his stuff too, there's still just some like really foundational genius um, ways of thinking outlined in his work. And one of the things that he was talking about in his last books was walking away from civilization, like
Mm,
this idea that we can just stop participating in it rather
mm,
than like not even necessarily overthrowing it or
mm. Sure.
whatever. We can just stop participating in it as best we can. And he was
Yeah.
wrong that that's easy. I think
Sure.
one of the things he said was like
Yeah.
civilization has no defense against abandonment. Dude,
Mm.
have you heard of the Great Wall of China?
Yeah. Yeah. I was good. I think that's kind
Literally,
of the whole
literally built
shtick.
to
Yeah.
keep farmers in. Literally
Yeah.
a wall, the stretch of the continent, no, country.
Right.
Anyway,
Yeah.
so there
Yeah.
are
Also, just like
barriers
the
there.
land policy of the United States. That's
Totally.
like totally central
Yes.
to, just like
Absolutely.
disrupting indigenous
Absolutely.
lifeways and disrupting
Yes.
people's
Totally.
ability to choose alternatives. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. So, alternatives are challenging to get to,
Mm,
but on a small scale, they are more possible than large scale transformation, at least in terms of large scale revolution. And I think,
mhm.
and I'm not saying like do one thing or the other. If you're into rewilding and you are wanting to go, if you're wanting to dismantle the larger structures, I'm
Sure.
not gonna be the one to stop that other than just like the warning that another one of these sort of challenges is the realm of accelerationism, which I didn't
Mm,
understand back in the day when I was sort of like more into the so-called anti-civ movement,
mm,
spawned by like Derek Jensen and those folks in terms of like we need to take down civilization.
right.
Um, I never understood fully like why is it the white supremacists want to take down civilization, right? Like there's these questions
Mm,
you have to ask. It's
hmm
called
hmm
accelerationism when they want to do it.
Yeah.
From the Derek Jensen perspective, it was the sooner we can bring down civilization, the better the chances we have after a collapse because there will still be more
Right.
life and resources
Yeah.
left, which makes sense to me.
Yeah.
However, when you have this accelerationist perspective, which is we need to break down society so that we create a power vacuum that we can then fill with our white
Mhm.
supremacist beliefs, right? I think
Yeah.
it's short-sighted for the anti-civ oriented people to think about what will take the place in the power vacuum when things collapse, as things
Yeah.
collapse.
Yeah.
And if it's going to happen anyway, which is sort of their perspective, then
Sure.
maybe they don't care at all. Um,
Hmm
but for me, that's like a really huge challenge is sort of like thinking about that idea of like, well, as collapse intensifies, there are going to be societies that come down and power
Right.
vacuums.
Right.
And who fills those? And we're kind of, right now it's looking like populists and fascists
Yeah.
are the ones that
Yeah.
are primed to take those places, which is um, another reason why I like to defend the term rewilding as best I can,
Mm.
because I see it from time to time co-opted by fascists as well.
Right. Right. Yeah. hmm
All right, last thoughts.
Last thoughts. I just had a thought and I completely lost track of it. Um, I'm just gonna sit here quietly until something comes to me or
Yeah.
you say something.
Yeah. Let's
Yeah.
see. What else is there to talk about around this?
Oh,
Oh,
have you read the book? Just on the topic of like rewilding and not rewilding. You've read what's his name? The guy the one It Could Happen Here, that guy, Robert Evans. Yeah. Have you
which
read
book?
his I think it was like a audio series. I read it. Well, I'm using the word lightly. I listened to it. It was like a um it was basically about his he took his experiences with watching like religious extremists in Southwest Asia, kind of, filling power vacuums and taking over, and kind of like took that experience and placed it on this continent and was looking at like Christo-fascist stuff and like what it might look like to have people kind of step into those power vacuums and have the United States dissolve and then become all of these little smaller states with, have you read this?
Is this the fictional After the
It's fictional.
Revolution?
Yeah, I think that's what it's called. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
After the
Uh,
Revolution. Yeah, you
yeah.
recommended it, and I listened to the audio version, and I loved it.
Yeah, I loved it too, but I feel like there's definitely some themes in there, right? Of
Hmm.
like, the thing I appreciate about it both that it gives me a way to kind of conceptualize the future, like a possibility of like, oh, this is what, you know, the dissolution of centralized power in the United States could look like, and what it could look like to have these power vacuums emerging and being filled. And then also just like, like the um like a what is the city with the cars and it's moving and do you know what I'm
Oh
talking
yeah,
about?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Yes, the roaming soldier, weird
Yeah.
city, ex-soldier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, I just thought there were some like I feel like that's somewhere in like if we are talking about rewilding, that's like somewhere in that spectrum.
Totally. It makes
And I
me think
really
of
appreciated it.
there
Yeah,
was a
go ahead.
book that came out in like the 70s or 80s called Ecotopia. Did you ever read that one?
No, I don't think so.
That was basically like Cascadia, the bioregion, like secedes
Mm,
from the United States.
mhm.
And basically they have like nuclear weapons and they threaten to nuke a town or whatever. I don't remember exactly how it happens. But it's like,
Mhm.
years into this thing and a person goes in there to like hang out and see what it's like.
Yeah,
And it's similar in some ways. It's definitely more like hippie utopian than apocalyptic, post-apocalyptic shatter zones or
sure.
whatever.
Yeah.
Um, but it's just interesting the way different people like sort of envision what's possible in the future. And there's no real way to know. I think that the biggest sort of like the biggest thing that's challenging to us or that's coming our way is just the larger environmental changes that are on the
Yeah.
way.
Mhm.
And yeah, those are the wild card. It's sort of like I just think I think of the Game of Thrones example where you have all of these people vying for power on this,
Mhm.
in this empire that's essentially meaningless because there's a fucking long winter cold storm coming that's going to wipe everybody out anyway, which is climate
Yeah.
change. And I think
Yeah.
about that a lot in terms of the states.
Yeah, that is a very apt comparison.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Yeah. Well, maybe
um,
we'll have capitalism on Mars soon.
no,
So,
no. Please, no. Elon Musk can go do that by himself over there. Let him go.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, I hope this gave people some more perspective on the wrong way to rewild or what rewilding means. And maybe I'll come up with a funny do's and don'ts. Thank you for joining me on this cast, cow friend. Uh,
Hello. Thank you.
this was awesome. I appreciate it. And yeah, thank you everybody for listening in. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Rewilding Podcast. Check the show notes for a list of resources that we mentioned in our conversation. If this episode inspired you, made you think more deeply, or gave you some new tools to use, make sure to subscribe and become a patron at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. And as I said before, if you're new to rewilding and want to expand your perception of it, I recommend attending one of my Rewilding 101 workshops, which I offer both in person in Portland, Oregon, and online for those who live around the world via Zoom. You can check upcoming dates and register at rewildportland.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.